why are you going through these incredible gymnastics, finding current soldiers or other soldiers to rename? And you slipped a minute ago. You said we're returning these bases to their original name.
Imagine this: military bases named after men who betrayed their country, fought to preserve slavery, and turned their backs on the very values the United States stands for. For decades, we've honored traitors as heroes, their names etched in stone, their legacies passed down to new generations. But the truth is undeniable. These men waged war against the United States for the sake of oppression. It's time to ask, why are we still glorifying those who fought to destroy our nation?
Senator, the veterans and service members across the country who have deployed from Fort Bragg or Fort Benning or Fort Hood or Fort Pickett.
One prominent figure in this discussion is Senator Angus King, who has expressed concern about the historical implications of maintaining such names. Senator King, who grew up in Virginia, reflects on his childhood memories of celebrating Robert E. Lee's birthday. At the time, Lee was widely revered in the South, and his birthday even served as a school holiday. However, as King grew older and learned more about American history, he came to view Robert E. Lee differently. Lee, a prominent Confederate general during the American Civil War, played a key role in the South's secession from the United States and the fight to preserve slavery. King argues that by the classic definition, Lee was a traitor. He points out that Lee took up arms against his own country, breaking his oath as a member of the United States Army, an oath he had taken when he entered West Point. This is a serious accusation, and King's comments highlight the contradiction that has long existed in how the nation remembers its past. The conversation becomes more pointed when King questions why the U.S. military is engaged in what he describes as incredible gymnastics to find soldiers or other historical figures to rename. Lee, who has long been honored with military bases named after him, is just one example of the figures being re-examined in the current renaming efforts. King argues that these efforts to rename military bases are an important step in correcting the nation's historical missteps. Senator King specifically challenges the defense of maintaining these names, which often cite tradition and emotional ties to soldiers who trained at these bases. He notes the absurdity of romanticizing figures like Lee, whose legacy is fundamentally tied to betrayal, and the defense of an institution that violated the principles of liberty and equality that the United States stands for. By continuing to honor Lee and other Confederate leaders, King argues the U.S. is perpetuating a version of history that undermines the very values that the nation seeks to uphold. King's perspective is not just about the technicalities of renaming military bases, but about the broader moral question. Why should the U.S. continue to glorify figures who fought to tear the nation apart? He stresses that this is not a case of erasing history, but rather refusing to celebrate betrayal. Lee, he asserts, was not a misunderstood hero, but a man who fought to preserve slavery, a practice that was morally indefensible. In a country that prides itself on its commitment to equality and freedom, it's difficult to justify the continued celebration of figures who stood for the exact opposite. This challenge is particularly relevant in the context of the U.S. military, which prides itself on values such as duty, loyalty, and patriotism. The military serves as a symbol of national unity, yet the continued use of Confederate names on military bases undermines that unity. These names represent a time when a group of Americans took up arms to preserve slavery and maintain an unjust system. To continue to honor these figures in the name of tradition, King argues, is a form of historical gaslighting that confuses national pride with the celebration of traitors. The debate over renaming military bases is an opportunity for the U.S. to take a hard look at its history and make a conscious decision about the legacy it wishes to promote. Senator King's challenge is not about erasing history, but about ensuring that the history that is celebrated aligns with the values of equality and justice that the country stands for. If maintaining the names of Confederate leaders is seen as a moral issue, then it's time to ask why the U.S. is still debating whether to stop glorifying figures who fought against the Union and for the continuation of slavery. It's a question that cuts through the noise of political rhetoric and forces the country to confront uncomfortable truths about its past. In part 2 of the discussion surrounding the renaming of military bases named after Confederate leaders, Senator King continues to challenge the prevailing justifications for keeping these names. He focuses on the argument that renaming these bases would erase history, which has been a common defense put forward by those who oppose the change. This defense hinges on the idea that the names of these bases have become ingrained in the military culture, with soldiers developing emotional connections to these places based on their history and the legacies of those after whom the bases were named. Senator King questions this logic, arguing that what is truly being erased is not history itself, but the selective glorification of certain historical figures whose actions ran counter to the values the United States stands for. He is deeply critical of the emotional ties that some soldiers claim to have with these Confederate names. King points out that the real question should be whether the history being honored is worthy of respect in the first place. To maintain military bases named after Confederate generals who took up arms against the United States in a war to preserve slavery is to perpetuate a false narrative about their place in American history. The debate shifts to the nature of loyalty and values within the military. The military's core values, such as duty, honor, and loyalty, are tied to the principles that the United States has historically upheld, such as liberty, equality, and justice. For Senator King, the continued use of Confederate names on military bases represents a moral contradiction, as these names stand in opposition to the very values that the military is supposed to embody. If the emotional connection to these bases is based on loyalty to names that represent betrayal, King asks whether the military needs to redefine what it stands for. The senator's challenge goes deeper than simply removing Confederate names. It is a call to examine what kind of pride the military should stand for. If soldiers are indeed emotionally attached to bases named after figures who fought against the country to preserve an unjust institution, then it is time to reconsider what that attachment says about the values soldiers are being taught to uphold. This emotional bond, according to King, is not tied to the principles of freedom or justice, but to a misplaced reverence for figures who chose to betray the nation's ideals. Senator King's argument is not just a moral one, but also a call for accountability. The continued defense of Confederate base names, despite the clear historical context of those figures, is a failure to confront the uncomfortable truths of American history. By holding on to these names, the military sends a message that some aspects of the past are worth celebrating, even if they directly contradict the values the nation claims to support. This, King argues, is a dangerous precedent to set, as it fosters an environment where historical injustices are minimized or ignored in favor of tradition. In practical terms, renaming these bases would not erase history, but rather provide a more accurate representation of the United States' commitment to its founding principles. The idea that renaming bases is somehow an erasure of history is a misrepresentation. What is really being erased is the glorification of those who fought against the United States to uphold slavery, not the historical events themselves. By removing Confederate names, the country is not forgetting the Civil War, but instead taking a stand against the aspects of that history that should not be celebrated. The debate about renaming these bases is part of a broader reckoning with America's history of slavery, racism, and inequality. It is an opportunity for the country to demonstrate that it has learned from its past mistakes and is committed to building a future based on equality and justice for all its citizens. Senator King's challenge to the current narrative is about moral clarity. It's about rejecting the idea that tradition should ever be an excuse for upholding the legacy of betrayal. Ultimately, King's argument is simple. If the names of these bases are tied to betrayal, then those names should not be honored. The military is a symbol of national unity, and continuing to honor figures who sought to destroy that unity is contradictory to the values that the military represents. Renaming these bases is not erasing history. It is a step toward recognizing the mistakes of the past and ensuring that the future is built on a foundation of justice and equality. The question remains, why continue to honor those who fought for treason when the nation has moved beyond such principles?